Darkness had fallen, blanketing the house in an unsettling stillness. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house. The wind outside whispered through the trees, adding to the eerie atmosphere. 17-year-old Sarah was home alone, her parents away on a weekend trip. She had initially relished the idea of having the house to herself, but as the hours dragged on, the solitude began to weigh heavily on her. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Each tick seemed louder than the last, echoing through the empty house like a countdown to something unknown. Sarah tried to focus on her book, but a strange uneasiness crept up her spine. The words on the page blurred as her mind wandered to the shadows lurking in the corners of the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and writhe, fueled by her growing anxiety. She could almost see shapes forming, dark figures that danced just out of the reach of the dim light. "It's just your imagination," she muttered, forcing a laugh to break the tension. But the sound of her own voice in the empty room only made her feel more isolated. But deep down, a shiver of apprehension ran through her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond her vision. The local news had reported a string of break-ins recently, and the thought gnawed at the edges of her bravado. She had tried to dismiss it, telling herself that their neighborhood was safe, but the fear was persistent. The memory of the news anchor's grave tone and the images of ransacked homes played on a loop in her mind. She glanced at the locked front door, wondering if it was enough to keep the dangers of the night at bay. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell, vulnerable to the unknown threats lurking outside. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to convince herself that everything was fine, but the unease was relentless, a constant reminder of her isolation. Trying to distract herself, Sarah decided to make some hot chocolate. As she walked into the kitchen, a sudden cold draft sent goosebumps erupting over her skin. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She glanced around, her heart pounding, but saw nothing out of place. "Just the wind," she whispered, hoping to convince herself. The old house was full of creaks and groans, remnants of its age and the countless storms it had weathered. But tonight, each sound seemed amplified, taking on a sinister quality that set her on edge. She clutched the warm mug of hot chocolate, seeking comfort in its familiarity. As Sarah settled back on the couch, the lights flickered. She had been feeling uneasy all evening, a sense of foreboding hanging in the air. The flickering lights only heightened her anxiety, making her feel as though the walls were closing in on her. The sudden darkness was suffocating. It was as if the room itself had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting for something to happen. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence. Her pulse quickened as she strained to see in the gloom, her mind conjuring up images of unseen threats lurking just beyond her vision. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house amplified in the stillness. She felt as though she was being watched, though she couldn't see by whom or what. The lights flickered back on, but the sense of unease lingered. The brief respite of light did little to calm her nerves. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see something out of place. Something that didn't belong. "Probably just an old circuit," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just a minor electrical issue, but deep down she knew it was more than that. The house had never felt this way before. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her raw nerves. She could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, each second dragging her deeper into her own fear. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with tension. Then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the other side of the room. It was so faint that she thought she might have imagined it, but the chill that ran down her spine told her otherwise. She strained to hear, her breath caught in her throat. It was a sound that sent a chill down her spine, a sound that said she wasn't alone. The whisper seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to communicate something to her. She felt a presence in the room, something unseen but undeniably there. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but all she could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear. Her breath caught in her throat as she whipped her head around her eyes, scanning the darkened corners of the room. The whisper seemed closer now, more insistent. It was followed by another sound, a sudden sharp crash from upstairs. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her, paralyzing her for a moment. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Sarah slowly rose from the couch, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wished desperately that she hadn't sent her dog, Max, to stay with her grandparents for the weekend. He would have at least barked, let her know if it was just the wind or something more sinister. Grasping her phone, she fumbled to dial her parents' number, her fingers trembling. The line was dead. Panic surged through her as she tried again and again, but only the hollow silence greeted her. She was completely cut off, alone in the large dark house with whatever was making those noises. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of leaves against the windows sent her heart racing. The whispers seemed to be getting louder, closer, wrapping around her like icy fingers. She could feel her fear threatening to consume her, but she knew she couldn't give in. She had to stay calm, had to find a way out. Suddenly, a loud pounding echoed from the front door. Sarah jumped, her blood turning to ice. The pounding came again, more insistent this time, rattling the old frame. Terror threatened to overwhelm her. She crept towards the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. The pounding stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow more unsettling. She could feel her heart thudding against her ribs, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Taking a deep breath, Sarah tried to rationalize the situation. It could be a prank, some kids from school trying to scare her, but her gut told her otherwise. The intensity of the pounding, the way it seemed to vibrate through the house, felt different, more menacing. She inched closer to the window, peering out into the darkness. The streetlight on the corner was out, casting the neighborhood in a pool of shadows. Straining her eyes, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods across the street, partially hidden by the darkness. Section 8. The Disappearance. The figure was tall and slender, almost skeletal, and seemed to be watching the house. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't make out any features, but she could sense the figure's gaze, cold and predatory, fixed on her. Then as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. Was it her imagination, or had she really seen someone? Doubt gnawed at her. The shadows seemed to dance and twist, playing tricks on her eyes. She knew she couldn't stay here, vulnerable and alone. She had to get out. Section 9. The Figure in the Window. It was a night like any other, or so Sarah thought. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, a silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. As she turned to grab her phone, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. Her blood ran cold. It was a fleeting shadow, a whisper of motion that sent a shiver down her spine. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The figure was back, this time pressed against the living room window, its face a mask of malice pressed against the glass. It was the same figure she had seen before, always lurking in the shadows, always watching. The face was twisted in a grotesque grin, eyes burning with a malevolent light. Its eyes, two glowing embers in the darkness, stared directly at her. They seemed to pierce through her very soul, filling her with a dread she couldn't shake. The eyes were unblinking, unwavering, as if they were waiting for something, some reaction from her. A scream caught in her throat, a strangled gasp that died in the stillness of the house. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if she were frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle her terror. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. She could feel the cold sweat trickling down her back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure outside the window didn't move, its glowing eyes boring into her, feeding on her fear. It was as if it thrived on her terror, growing stronger with each passing second. The longer she stared, the more real it became, until she could see every detail of its twisted face. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, and Sarah was trapped within it. She knew she had to do something, anything, to break free from the paralyzing fear. But what could she do? The figure was relentless, its presence suffocating. She felt like a prisoner in her own home with no escape in sight. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity as the figure continued to watch, waiting for its moment. Section 10. The Chase. Adrenaline surged through her veins, overriding her fear. Turning, she bolted for the back door, fumbling with the lock in her haste. The pounding on the front door started again, louder and more insistent this time, accompanied by the splintering of wood, as if someone was trying to break it down. The back door swung open, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She raced into the darkness, her lungs burning, her feet pounding on the pavement as she ran towards the safety of the woods behind her house. She didn't dare look back, could hear the heavy footsteps of her pursuer gaining on her. Section 11. Conclusion. The sounds of the chase, the pounding heart, the gasping breaths, all faded into a muffled roar as Sarah ran until she could run no more. She collapsed on the forest floor, her chest heaving, her mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. She was alone, but was she safe? As she crouched there, hidden amongst the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike again.